Hey everyone, today on Big Al Books, I'm going to be attempting a very large wrap-up. This is the situation behind me. I've got about 19 books that I've read from the last few days of December and throughout the month of January that I haven't talked about yet, and it is now the middle of February, so I hope that your 2019 is off to more of a productive start than my year has been. In this video, I'm going to try to catch you up on all the books that I've been reading so far this year. I am going to try to make this video under 20 minutes, which means that I don't have a ton of time to unpack these books, so I will try my best to be concise. And if you'd like to hear more about these books in any more detail, we can for sure talk about them in the comments. So I guess I should stop wasting precious time in this introduction. Let's get to talking about this stack of books. So to start off, we're going to have to go back in time to December 2018. There were 3 books I read in particular to prepare for the holiday season, and the first one of these was Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre, and I kind of like reading books that I think are going to be kind of depressing or that might challenge society, because I kind of grow tired of the forced cheerfulness that you find out in the world during the holiday season, so I thought this classic novel from the French existentialist movement would be perfect, and it was a great time of year to read this book. This is all about a guy who is kind of just like so disgusted with the idea of existence that it starts to make him physically sick, and it's kind of a book that like I was like half very fascinated by the writing and the feelings and sensations that Sartre was describing in this book, but then I was also half kind of annoyed with this main character who really acted like he was better than everyone in this town that he lived in, and like he's the only one that really understands what's going on. So I found him kind of tiresome, but this book did have some really brilliant moments. In particular, there's a scene where the main character kind of has this breakdown after looking at the root of a chestnut tree, and really that shouldn't be a fascinating scene, and yet it somehow was, and Sartre just like breaks your mind while reading about this chestnut tree, so that was very memorable, and I'm glad that I gave this one a go. The next book I picked up for the holidays was Hark, the Herald Angels Scream, which is a collection of holiday-themed horror short stories, and it was edited by Christopher Golden. Not gonna lie, this was definitely a cover buy for me. I could not say no to this little guy, but this is kind of like any anthology of short stories. It was totally a mixed bag. I find especially with horror short stories, they're really not gonna work for you if you don't find that particular premise to be creepy or strange. So there were a lot of stories in here that were just didn't really do it for me and seemed kind of forgettable, but there were a few standouts that I really enjoyed, so that made it worth going through this collection. Surprisingly enough, my favorite short story in this collection wasn't scary at all, but was actually really funny, so I just wasn't really expecting to find much humor in this collection, but the story Good Deeds by Jeff Strand was hilarious, and it makes fun of the song Christmas Shoes and kind of parodies like the motivations of the man who wrote that song and how that song affects other people. So that was my real standout from this collection. And the other one I picked up was Winter by Ali Smith, the second book in her seasonal quartet, and I did enjoy this one. I think I might have liked Autumn a little bit more, but this one has dysfunctional family drama at the core of this story, which of course I always gravitate towards, and I can't say that I love the characters that Ali Smith creates. I don't necessarily find that I like always understand who the people are in her novels, but it is fascinating to watch her riff on contemporary news stories and events that are happening quite recent to when they do happen. This book in particular touches on some issues regarding the refugee crisis, and I find stuff like that always hits me pretty hard since a lot of my students are Syrian refugees. So you read about some stuff in this book, like about how there was a GoFundMe page where British people were paying to actually like blockade boats that were trying to save refugees and to like send them back to their country. So like that was just really upsetting to read about. So this is kind of a book that like makes you mad and upset about the state of things, but also does leave you feeling kind of hopeful in some ways. Like it's not the most depressing book, so there's that. There was a dinner scene in this book that I really enjoyed where the characters were comparing their lives to a Shakespearean play where everyone's on stage and you can really only focus on your narrative and what's happening in your life without realizing that there are other characters on the stage with you, and if we could only realize that everyone on Earth is part of the same story. We might actually work together. So I thought that was like fascinating commentary. So there were definitely some standout moments in this one, and I'm glad that I'm following along with this seasonal quartet. After reading Winter by Ali Smith, I had to check out the Shakespeare play Cymbeline. Since this play is discussed quite a lot in Winter, there's one of the characters who tries to provide a synopsis of the play, and another character thinks that she's embarrassing herself because the play sounds so far-fetched and it sounds like this crazy fairy tale and like nothing that William Shakespeare would have written. So he thinks that like she just doesn't know what she's talking about. But then I actually did read the play and I realized that yeah, her synopsis is pretty spot on because this play is pretty ridiculous. Let's stop and admire this ridiculous edition of this play that I have with a $1 sticker that I just can't seem to remove. It also features an armpit for most of the cover, and there's a weird Kermit the Frog sticker that's on here for some reason. So not the best copy, but this was a pretty fun play. I feel like it features some elements that we've seen before in other Shakespeare plays, such as the like fake death potion that we saw in Romeo and Juliet, and then also some female characters dressing up like boys and confusing people. So like it takes these elements but puts them together in this really wacky kind of way. So like this whole play, like it feels like it shouldn't work, and the plot is pretty weird, and that made it a fun reading experience, even if the story itself isn't one of Shakespeare's more memorable ones. You know, this isn't one of his like artistic triumphs, I wouldn't say, but it was just fun purely for just being like, what the heck is going to happen, and how is Shakespeare ever going to resolve this very convoluted plot? Next up, I read Fever Dream by Samanta Schweblin. This was translated from the Spanish by Megan McDowell, who also translated Things We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enriquez. And what these two works have in common is that they're both just like really creepy and unsettling. So Things We Lost in the Fire is a short story collection, whereas Fever Dream is kind of a novella. It's pretty short, and even like the pages are like pretty small. So if you can read this book in one sitting, I would highly recommend doing so, because it's the kind of book that really sucks you in quite quickly. I feel like by page 2, I was already like invested, and I knew that it was going to be a one-sit read for me. So if you do have that time to dedicate to the experience, I would recommend it. This is kind of a creepy story about a woman who's trying to go back and recall what happened during her day to find out where things were going to go disastrously wrong for her, and it involves creepy children. And what I loved the most about this is that you don't really know if the events in the story happen because of supernatural reasons or because of real world reasons. So I find those are like the best scary stories, that there are like a few different explanations for what's going on. It's never entirely clear. So this was definitely a fun read for me. I read it on a night where I was home alone, and yeah, it was one where I was making sure to turn on the lights before I went into each room. So it did effectively creep me out for sure. The final book that I read in 2018 was Vida Nostra. I definitely finished my reading year with a bang because this book was sensational. This is by a husband and wife duo of authors. They're called Marina and Sergey Dyachenko, and this was translated from the Russian by Julia Meitov Hersey. So, first of all, if anyone tells you that this is some kind of Russian Harry Potter, don't listen to them. Like, this book is not really like a fantastical book about a magic school. I mean, it has some of those elements, but there is nothing that is really like fun and uplifting about this book. I mean, the main sensation that you get while you're reading this book is just like utter confusion and desolation. Like, it is not really a fun read for the most part. The students who are at the school are kind of there against their own will, and basically they're threatened that their family members are going to have fatal accidents if they don't kind of play by the rules, and they don't understand why they're at the school or what they're even studying or what they're like training for. So you as the reader are also going through that experience where you just don't know what the heck is happening. But what's so fascinating about this book is that you're mesmerized the whole time. Like, you don't know what's going on, but I did not want to put this book down. And I feel surprised that it was like only one book. Like, I feel like I went through a whole series worth of experiences in this thing, and it really is worth the payoff. I loved the final part of this book, and you can see what it's building to and what these characters are going through, and all the confusion does pay off. So this was an incredible read, and I'm so glad that I finished my reading year with a great novel like this one. Moving into 2019, the first book that I read this year was A Terrible Country by Keith Gessen. This book is also kind of Russian-inspired. It is about a really annoying grad student American kid who moves back to live with his aging grandmother in Russia, and he kind of moves to Russia like wanting to like understand what modern Russia is like. So at the start of the book, he's just like thrown off by everything that he's seeing, and he's like, oh man, Russia is so weird. And unfortunately, his opinion doesn't get much more sophisticated throughout the book. You kind of hope that his experiences would build up to him having a new kind of insight or understanding about Russian society, but that doesn't really happen in this book. It just seems very shallow, just like, yeah, Moscow is pretty messed up, guys. So basically, I just did not enjoy spending time with this narrator. I didn't like his voice. I didn't really care for his story, so this one was a flop for me and was kind of a disappointing start to my reading year. The next book that I read was Confessions by Kanae Minato, which was translated from the Japanese by Snyder, and oh man, this book was just like all kinds of messed up. I can't even tell you about the plot because I don't want to ruin anything for you. All I can say is that there's like an insane plot twist in this book on page 50 that really had me shook. All I'm going to say is that it involves school children and some contaminated milk, and it is like truly one of the most messed up things that I read, and I was living for it. My main problem with this book is that you get such a shock at the beginning, but the rest of the book wasn't really as exciting as that initial plot twist. So I kind of just wish that this was just like a 60-page short story and it kind of ended there. I would have given that 5 stars, but then because this book unfolds and explores the story from different angles, it kind of lost a lot of its like shock power and momentum, so I didn't enjoy it as much stretched out throughout a novel. But if you're looking for something like dark and twisted, this is definitely a thriller that you could check out. Moving on to the graphic novels that I read, I started 2 new series this month. One of them was Paper Girls by Bryan K. Vaughn and Cliff Chiang. I read volume 1, and I do like the art style and the cool colors that they use, but this story is like very confusing, and I'm not sure where it's going, and I'm not sure that I'm really big on the whole like 80s nostalgia thing, so I'm kind of on the fence with whether I'm going to continue with this series, but please let me know if this is one that you recommend, because I really like Saga by Bryan K. Vaughn, so I'm a little unsure about this one. I also started reading the Snotgirl series by Brian Lee O'Malley and Leslie Hung. I mean, I don't even know what to say about these books. Like, it's kind of embarrassing. It's about a really self-centered fashion blogger and her terrible friends, and she gets involved in this kind of like mystery, and you don't really know what is reality in this book, which I feel like is kind of fitting for social media stars since they do live in this kind of like fantasy projection of life. So in some ways I'm like pretty hooked in this series. It is kind of like ridiculous and trashy, you know, it's definitely not highbrow, but it is a lot of fun reading these, and I think this is a series that I will be continuing with. And also I was reading this series while I did get a pretty bad cold, so I was just constantly blowing my nose, so you know, Snotgirl was just sadly all too relatable for me while I was reading these books. The best graphic novel that I read this month was definitely The 100 Nights of Hero by Isabel Greenberg. I was so psyched to find a cheap copy of this on Book Outlet. This is such a nice graphic novel, and I really love the size of it because it kind of feels like you're reading a kid picture book, and that's what this felt like at night. Like I was a kid and I was getting my story before I was going to sleep, and it just made me so happy. This graphic novel is a take on the Scheherazade tale from the 1001 Nights. Basically, these 2 women have to just keep telling compelling story night after night to prevent this man from doing something terrible, and that's what I love about this book. It's just a collection of just some really cool stories. Most of them have this kind of feminist angle, so it was just like a really neat collection that was just celebrating sisterhood and reading and the magic of storytelling, and I loved this to bits. Another magical book that I read this month was this collection, Embers, One Ojibway's Meditations by Richard Wagamese. Now, normally this kind kind of book like isn't really my type of thing, where it kind of like takes these like pictures of nature with these like inspirational captions to them. So like not normally something I go for, but I just truly love Richard Wagamese. He is just such a fabulous writer, and he's no longer with us, which makes me really sad, but it was so valuable and so fascinating reading his reflections on life. And this was like a very inspirational book to read at the start of the year, because it does make you want to like do better and to live more intentionally and to like appreciate certain moments in your life. So this book was a really beautiful read. I kind of like just flipping through the pages and just like letting one of the teachings pop up at random so that I can reflect on it in my own life. And if you are looking to learn a little bit more about Ojibway spirituality, then this is a really beautiful little short book to check out. The first short story collection that I finished this year was Love in a Fallen City by Eileen Chang. Most of these stories were translated by Karen S. Kingsbury, but I know at least one of them, Eileen Chang, translated into English herself. And I always find that cool when authors are translating their own works. And you can kind of see like how the voice differs from the translator to the author. And these short stories kind of reminded me of the experience that you get when you're reading an Alice Munro kind of short story, where they're like much more expansive than your usual slice of life short story. Like they are more on the like 50 to 60 page length, so you get quite immersed in a story, and you usually get to see the story unfold over time, which I really enjoy. Eileen Chang is kind of famous for writing bitter love stories, and yeah, she definitely did not fail to deliver on that front. Pretty much all of these stories are about relationships that really do not work out well, or they're like the kind of relationship where even if the couple stays together, you know that it's a mistake and they're not happy. For some reason, I just really enjoyed reading these stories in the bathtub, where I could just like relax and lose myself in the stories of these like tortured people in very troubling situations. Plus, the setting is really gorgeous in all of these stories. You get to see Shanghai and Hong Kong in this bygone era. So this was a really solid collection of short stories, and I'm sure that I will read more Eileen Chang in the future. Moving on, there were two big books that took me most of the month of January to work my way through. The first of these was the novel The Mandarins by Simone de Beauvoir, which was translated from the French by Leonard M. Friedman. And this is a book that explores the life of a group of friends in the Parisian intellectual scene during the post-war years. So it's kind of like this like lost time, where when the war was going on, these people were involved in the resistance and they had purpose in their life, and now the war has ended and they don't really know what they should be doing. So this book explores the responsibility of the artist during times of political upheaval, and whether intellectuals and artists are kind of morally obligated to be involved in politics, whether they like them or not. So it has a lot of fascinating depictions of just like the political conflicts of the time, but then there are also like a lot of very like emotional subplots in this book, because you know the friends are like getting into these love affairs. Particularly one of the main characters, Anne, gets involved in a relationship with a man overseas, and she falls in love with him, but she doesn't want to give up her life and her husband in Paris, and I was like, oh, creating so much conflict. So I really liked that this book kind of hooked me on this like intellectual level, but also this emotional one. It really did make me feel a lot of things, which I love in a book. So I will say that this one was like slow to get started. Like it took maybe like 300 pages before I really felt like I was into it, but like once I did, I couldn't put this thing down, and I really did value the experience that I had reading this book. And I know that I curse myself when I say that I'm going to review something and talk about it in more detail, but I really would like to make another video on this book, because I feel like it is kind of like underrated, and it was a great read. The other big book that I read in January was a biography of Mary Queen of Scots by Antonia Fraser. I've kind of decided that I've wanted to devote more of my time to reading some biographies in 2019, and this was the first one I started off with because I went to see the film Mary Queen of Scots, and like, oh man, guys, that movie was a mess, and it left me more confused about the story than I was going into it. So I came out of that movie, and like there were so many things that seemed like they were like Hollywoodized sexualized or like that just were blatantly untrue. So I felt like I had to go then and buy this book and actually do some research for myself to figure out what the heck went on with this lady. And I'm really glad that I did this. I really enjoyed myself reading this biography. And it's kind of funny, like, that you kind of know the story going in and you know how it's gonna end. And honestly, I still cried at the end of this book when Mary was getting executed. Like, it still hit me because, you know, when you spend this much time with the person, I guess you start to get attached. And I will say about this book that Antonia Fraser is like very biased in like the direction of Mary Queen of Scots, and like it's a very sympathetic portrayal. So I guess it's maybe not like the most objective biography out there. I don't know, I haven't read any other ones, but I thought that this gave me a good handle on the story and so many of the like oddities and absurdities of Mary's story. So Antonia is not really like afraid to get into like how kind of confusing the history can be to patch together. So I found this like quite enjoyable, and I'm excited to continue to read more biographies in 2019. After devoting so much of my time to reading about Mary Queen of Scots, I also wanted to learn a little bit more about Elizabeth I, and this is like a tiny little biography of her by Helen Castor. This is from the Penguin Monarchs series. They're kind of just these like little hardbacks that are each focused on giving like a brief account of a British monarch. Of course, this is not a comprehensive biography by any means. It's really if you're looking for just like a more quick overview. So I will say that like this was kind of nice in just like learning more about her life in under 100 pages. This one was subtitled A Study in Insecurity, so it was kind of about the ways that Elizabeth was like threatened and lived in like this unstable period, and she still managed to be this really formidable leader. So I enjoyed reading this book, and it was funny because this version of the Mary Queen of Scots story was quite different from, like I said, the very like sympathetic version that you find here. So it was kind of cool reading these books around the same time. And I will definitely be looking for a longer and more thorough biography on Elizabeth, but this was a nice introduction. The next book that I read was Fingersmith by Sarah Waters, and I'm not going to say too much about this book because it is quite the booktube darling, and I really did not like this book, and I'm not entirely sure why. I think because this novel is very plot heavy, and I was just not engaged with the plot at any point in this book. Like, all everyone talks about are like the epic plot twists that happen, but like they only disappointed me. I really was not impressed, and it's the kind of book where you have to go through the same events from different perspectives, but to me I found that device very tiresome in this book because there wasn't enough of a change to make me want to actually have to read about the same scenes twice. And then just the resolution of the book, I felt like I just had to like finish, and the plot had to resolve itself, and like it just didn't really work for me. So I am kind of very sad about that. I thought I would love this one, but I am willing to give Sarah Waters a second chance. So if you like any of her books better than this one, please give me a recommendation, because I was quite sad about not liking this one, but it didn't work for me at all. The last book that I read this month was a short little gem of a book. This is Master of Reality by John Darnielle. This is an installation in the 33 and a half series, where basically they're like these like really short kind of essays about certain classic albums in like rock and alternative music. So I've been meaning to read this series, but this is a very unconventional book in the series because it's actually framed as kind of like a fictional story, whereas I think the other ones are just more like straight up, they explain the album. But John Darnielle structures this examination of the album through a teenage boy who has been institutionalized for his mental health problems, and it's kind of his journal, and it also is him 10 years later reflecting back on that time of his life. And first of all, like, it really made me appreciate this Black Sabbath album. Not really one of my favorites by Sabbath, but it did forced me to kind of sit down and listen to the music, and like I loved how John Darnielle wrote about the music. He really sold this album to me, but mostly this is just about how teenagers have this really strong and powerful relationship with music, and how society kind of like tries to like strip away that connection sometimes, even though it's like the thing that matters the most, and how teenagers really feel like albums are like the only things that like understand them in their lives sometimes. I really related to those themes, and I thought that this was just like a really beautiful book. It was heartbreaking in a lot of ways about just like how adults don't really understand adolescence sometimes, particularly those with mental health concerns. But this was just like a really sad kind of story about like a teenager who was like let down by the system, but also like a fascinating examination of this Black Sabbath album. So this was just like a really cool introduction to this series. So hoping to read some more books in here because it really did get me thinking about music in new ways. So I loved this little book a lot. So that's it. We have reached the end of this inexcusably long, gigantic January wrap-up. Please let me know how your 2019 reading year has been going so far. Has it been a strong start to the year? Have you found any new great reads? I would love to hear about all of that. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again soon.